Most people think the most dangerous person in the room is the loudest one. They're wrong. The most dangerous person you will ever underestimate is the one who absorbed everything quietly, smiled while they were bleeding, and one day simply stopped showing up. You never saw it coming, and that is exactly the point. What you're about to understand isn't a motivational speech. It isn't toxic positivity dressed up in soft language. This is behavioral psychology. This is what actually happens, neurologically, emotionally, and socially, when you take someone wired for deep emotional connection and you betray them. Because the transformation that follows is not what most people expect. It is not bitterness. It is not revenge. It is something far more unsettling. It is precision. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand people differently, including yourself. There is a specific type of person who processes the world differently from the majority. Researchers in psychology call this trait high emotional sensitivity. But in everyday life, we just recognize it by what this person does. They notice when your energy shifts before you say a word. They feel a room the moment they walk into it. They lie awake replaying conversations, not because they are paranoid, but because their nervous system is literally built to process social information at a deeper level. When you are happy, they feel it. When you are suffering, they feel that too. And when they love you, that love is not casual. It is total. This is not weakness. Neurologically, this is a different operating system. Studies in sensory processing sensitivity, pioneered by psychologist Dr. Elaine Aron, show that roughly 15 to 20% of the population has a nervous system wired to process environmental and emotional stimuli more deeply than average. The same neural architecture that makes them exquisitely attuned to beauty and connection also makes them exquisitely vulnerable to cruelty, to neglect, to betrayal. And here is where the story gets complicated. Because these deeply feeling people often attract a very specific kind of relationship dynamic, not always because of bad luck, but because of biology. When someone radiates warmth, emotional availability, unconditional presence, that is magnetic. For healthy people, it creates genuine intimacy. But for people with unhealed wounds, people who secretly fear abandonment or crave control, that kind of warmth becomes a resource, something to extract. And so the deeply sensitive person often finds themselves inside relationships where they give everything and the ledger is never balanced. And they stay. That is the part people outside the experience never understand. Why do they stay? Here is the behavioral psychology answer. It is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is a cognitive pattern called intermittent reinforcement. And it is the same neurological mechanism behind slot machine addiction. When kindness comes in unpredictable bursts, warm one day, cold the next, generous then distant, the brain does not learn to distrust the source. It becomes more attached to it. Dopamine spikes not when the reward arrives reliably, but when it arrives unexpectedly. The emotional roller coaster does not push the sensitive person away. It pulls them deeper in. So they stay. They explain. They forgive. They carry two people's emotional weight while pretending everything is fine. They absorb the bad behavior and search for context. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe I triggered something. Maybe if I love them better, things will shift. That belief is not naivety. It is kindness turned inward on itself like a blade. Now here's what actually happens inside the body during this period, because this is the part nobody talks about. Prolonged emotional stress, especially the kind that comes from being repeatedly disappointed by someone you love, activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Your cortisol stays elevated. Your nervous system runs hot, scanning constantly for threat, for shifts in tone, for signals of safety or danger in the person who is supposed to be your safe person. Over time, this creates a condition researchers call hypervigilance, not paranoia, pattern recognition under chronic stress. The emotionally sensitive person becomes extraordinarily good at reading micro-expressions, vocal tone shifts, behavioral inconsistencies, because their survival, emotionally speaking, has depended on it. And here is the counterintuitive truth that changes everything. They already know. Long before the conscious mind is ready to accept it, the nervous system has already logged every red flag, every inconsistency, every moment the words said one thing and the energy said another. The emotionally sensitive person has a running file in their subconscious that is extraordinarily accurate. They just spend months, sometimes years, arguing with that file, telling themselves they are being too sensitive, too suspicious, too demanding. The betrayal, when it finally arrives fully, is almost never a surprise to their nervous system. It is a confirmation. And that confirmation breaks something specific. Not just the relationship, not just the trust in that person. It breaks the internal argument. The one that kept telling them they were overreacting. And when that argument collapses, the sensitive person is left with the full, unfiltered weight of what they already knew, combined with the grief of the years they spent trying to be wrong. That is the moment the transformation begins. And this is where most people make the mistake of thinking that what follows is heartbreak, standard issue pain, the kind that heals in a few months with some self-care and new hobbies. But that is not what this is. What follows is a complete reorganization of the self. Psychologists who study post-traumatic growth, and yes, this qualifies as a form of emotional trauma, describe a phenomenon called schema revision. Schemas are the deep belief structures through which we interpret reality. Beliefs like people are mostly trustworthy, love is worth the risk, loyalty is eventually rewarded. When a significant betrayal shatters those schemas, the mind cannot simply patch them. It has to rebuild them from different materials, harder materials. This is why people in the outside world look at this person after the transformation and think they changed. As if change is the problem. They are correct. The person changed. Profoundly, irreversibly, and in ways that are actually adaptive rather than destructive, even if it does not feel that way from the outside. Here is what that change looks like in practice. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the silence of sadness, though that is present in the early phase. Eventually it becomes the silence of resolution. The emotionally sensitive person who once over-explained every decision, who once sent the long message and then the follow-up message and then the anxious check-in, stops. The silence that follows is not withdrawal. It is the sound of someone deciding that their peace is no longer negotiable. The second thing you notice is the speed of evaluation. Before the betrayal, this person gave the benefit of the doubt by default. Now they observe first. The warmth is still there internally, but the access has changed. They have developed what social scientists call calibrated skepticism. They are not cynical. They simply no longer confuse potential with pattern. They wait to see what someone does consistently before they decide what that person deserves. Third, and this is the one that confuses people most, the sensitivity does not disappear. This is the misconception. People who do not understand this kind of transformation assume that healing means becoming less emotional, less feeling, more guarded in a cold or detached sense. That is not what happens. The sensitivity is still entirely present. What is gone is the compulsion to spend that sensitivity on people who exploit it. The gift is still there. The open door policy is not. And this terrifies a specific subset of people, the ones who benefited from the door being open. Here is a behavioral truth that most people are not comfortable with. Certain relationship dynamics depend on one person having no limits. Not because the other person is necessarily malicious, though sometimes they are, but because the dynamic was built on an imbalance. When the imbalanced person develops equilibrium, the dynamic collapses. It cannot survive mutual respect, mutual accountability, mutual effort. It was never designed for that. So the people who are comfortable with the imbalance will often interpret the newly boundaried person as cold, as changed for the worse, as difficult. And they are right that something changed. They are wrong about the direction of the change. What they are experiencing is not the person becoming less, it is the person becoming whole. Now I want to talk about the silence in a different register, because there is a specific quality to the quiet that comes from a deeply sensitive person who has completed this transformation, and it is unlike any silence you will encounter elsewhere. Most people, when they are hurt, leak it. They go quiet in obvious ways. The clipped responses, the refusal to make eye contact, the loaded sighs. They want to be noticed. They want the other person to ask. They still need the relationship to respond to them. But the person we are describing here reaches a point where they have grieved the relationship completely on the inside, long before anything visibly changes on the outside. By the time they go quiet in the way others can see, they are not asking to be reached for. They have already reached a conclusion. The silence is not a door left ajar. It is a wall, assembled quietly over months, that the other person simply failed to notice being built. This is what people mean when they say you only realize what you lost after it was gone. But that phrase dramatically undersells the timeline. The deeply sensitive person was mentally preparing for the end while the other person was still assuming everything was fine. The mourning was done in private, at 2 a.m., over reread conversations and unanswered questions, and the slow, excruciating process of accepting that someone they loved was never going to love them the same way back. By the time the ending is visible, the sensitive person has already lived through it. That is one of the loneliest experiences available to a human being. Grieving a living relationship in secret while continuing to show up for it. And coming out of that grief, changed, is one of the most profound forms of strength you will ever witness in another person. Even if it does not look like strength from the outside, even if it looks like distance or coldness or someone becoming less accessible, what you are actually seeing is someone who survived their own interior collapse and rebuilt from the foundation up, with better materials, with more precision about what they will and will not carry. There is a specific thing that the healed, deeply sensitive person understands that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And it is this: being chosen is not the same thing as being valued. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. And the most excruciating education available to a human being is learning that distinction through lived experience rather than theory. Once you learn it that way, you cannot unlearn it. Remember that mechanism I mentioned at the beginning? Emotional object permanence collapse? Here is what it actually means. Object permanence is a concept from developmental psychology, the understanding that objects continue to exist even when you cannot see them. When babies develop object permanence, they understand that when mom leaves the room, mom still exists. She is just elsewhere. In adult emotional relationships, we have an equivalent function. Even when someone is physically absent or behaving badly or unavailable, we maintain an internal sense of connection to them. We think about them. We feel attached. We carry them inside us. Highly empathic people tend to have extremely strong emotional object permanence. They hold people in their emotional world with tremendous fidelity. They feel the connection even across distance, even across conflict, even across repeated injury. But there is a limit. And when that limit breaks, when the nervous system has processed too much chronic, unresolved pain from the same source, something extraordinary happens. The emotional object permanence collapses. The internal sense of connection simply dissolves. And the person the empath has been holding so faithfully in their emotional world becomes experientially almost like a stranger. This is not a decision. It is a neurological event. The brain, protecting itself from further damage, terminates the affective connection. And once that connection is gone, it is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Not because the empath decided to hold a grudge, but because the architecture that sustained the attachment no longer exists in the same form. This is why people are shocked when an empath becomes truly unreachable. It is not performance. It is not a tactic. It is not designed to create urgency or demand attention. The warmth is simply gone. And the person who caused its disappearance is usually the last one to understand why. And this leads us to the single most painful truth about hurting an empathic person. The truth that most people only discover far too late. And it reveals something disturbing about how we value emotional generosity in others until the moment we have completely destroyed it. There is a specific psychological phenomenon that occurs when people realize they have permanently lost access to someone who genuinely cared about them. It is called retrospective idealization combined with lost salience. What this means in plain language is simple. The moment the empath is truly gone, the moment their warmth becomes undeniably unavailable, the person who took them for granted suddenly recognizes what they had with devastating clarity. They remember the specific things the empath did that nobody else has ever done. The way they showed up without being asked. The way they noticed things nobody else noticed. The way they fought for the relationship with ferocious, quiet loyalty long after any reasonable person would have stopped. The way they saw something worth believing in, even inside someone who consistently showed them they were not worth staying for. And the grief that follows is not simple, because it is not just grief over losing a person. It is grief over recognizing who you were in that relationship. It is grief over seeing, with painful clarity, how you treated someone who was irreplaceable. And that kind of grief does not resolve easily, because there is nothing to do with it. The empath has not left in anger. They have left in peace. There is no door left open to re-enter. There is no dramatic finale to rewrite. There is just the quiet, permanent absence of someone who chose to stop carrying something that was destroying them. The deeply sensitive person who has completed this transformation carries something unusual inside them. They are still full of warmth, still capable of profound connection, still genuinely interested in other people's inner lives. But the channel through which that warmth flows has been refined. They no longer pour love into every available container regardless of whether it can hold what they give. They have become selective. And selective love, given fully, given with clear eyes, given by someone who knows exactly what it costs them and exactly what they will no longer accept in return, that kind of love is rare enough to be almost unfindable in the world. Which brings us to the part of this conversation that matters most. If you are someone who recognizes yourself in what has been described, the sensitivity, the long loyalty, the private grief, the slow rebuilding, understand something clearly. The transformation you went through was not a loss of who you were. It was a graduation. The part of you that loved without conditions was not the problem. The part of you that forgot to keep one of those conditions for yourself, that was the part that needed to change. Your capacity to feel deeply is not a flaw that needs to be corrected. It is a rare neurological and psychological trait that the right people will treasure. The work is not in dimming it. The work is in directing it toward people who are capable of receiving it without consuming it. And if you are someone watching this who recognizes themselves in the other role, the one who took, who drained, who mistook patience for permanence and forgiveness for permission, here is what behavioral psychology says about that. The window to be reached by this kind of person does not stay open indefinitely. Deeply sensitive people have extraordinary capacity for repair and reconciliation, but that capacity has a threshold. Once they have crossed into the grief phase, once the internal mourning is complete, the relationship no longer exists for them in the way it did. What you are left reaching for is a version of them that has already moved on inside themselves. This is not a tragedy of emotion, it is a function of self-preservation. The most evolved form of self-preservation available to a deeply feeling human being. And the final thing worth understanding, the piece that applies to all of us, regardless of where we fall on the sensitivity spectrum, is this. Emotional depth is not weakness dressed up in philosophical language. It is data. The deeply sensitive person is not experiencing more drama than others. They are processing more information than others, faster, with higher resolution, at greater personal cost. When that processing system is treated as a burden rather than a gift, when it is exploited rather than honored, it does not collapse. It reorganizes. It learns. And what it learns is permanent. The quietest people in any room are not always the ones with the least to say. Sometimes they are the ones who decided, after a very long time and a very deep kind of pain, that the people in that room had not yet earned the sound of their voice. Pay attention to who is not speaking. Pay attention to who has stopped trying to be understood. Pay attention to who used to give everything and now gives nothing to you specifically, while apparently thriving everywhere else. That is not someone who became cold, that is someone who became clear. And clarity, in a deeply sensitive person, is the most formidable thing you will ever witness.